Okay, I'm going to get started just because you don't want to lose a minute here. Some of you who were here Wednesday at the luncheon have already met Gracie. I have heard rave reviews about her talk then, and she has enough material that what she's going to do today is different. So you're not going to hear a repeat. So Gracie, why don't you tell us about yourself and let's go ahead and tell us about modern saints.
Sure. Thank you. Excellent. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay, so I'm Gracie Morbitzer. I'm an artist and small business owner behind the project The Modern Saints that's been up here in your lounge for a few weeks. We'll be for a little bit longer. And I am really excited to talk to you today about this project, about what icons are in general, and what I'm hoping to do with this project. So first, a little bit about me. I live here in Columbus, Ohio. I actually got married in September, and that's my cat Tater Tot. He's my good luck charm, so I always have to have him in the presentation. I began this project in 2016 as a side project while I was in college, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But in 2021, I was able to go full-time with this project, and actually had to. There was too much for me to take care of, so much that I had to do that I actually had to quit my job to be able to run it, and it's been great since then. So, and then in my other free time, I do more art. I like to travel. My degree from CCAD was interior architecture, so I try to keep up with some of that as well. And I love to do research and museum design. So, some of my faith background is that I grew up in the Catholic school system, and then attended Columbus College of Art and Design. And it's really because of those two very different worlds colliding, I guess you could say, that this project came out of that and all of the ideas I have because of it. So some information about icons, just very generally, about what they are and why they're different from regular religious art or something that's just nice for a wall. They're different in that they are meant to be meditated on, and they're meant to be looked at and contemplated. They're not just something to make a space more colorful, beautiful, or bright, whatever it is. They have a much more spiritual purpose than that. They're also considered the visual equivalent of written learning or Bible stories, and because of that, you may hear them referred to sometimes as being written rather than painted. That's because of that sort of terminology, and also some language translations between some of the more Eastern European cultures that still have a really robust practice of creating icons. And then something else that's different about them is that the person in them is portrayed mystically. And I'll talk a little bit about what this means design-wise, but basically it's just supposed to be a representation of the person as they are in heaven. So if it's a saint being represented, it's because we already know that they're in heaven, and it's something that comes from a really long history of other types of art styles, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But the process for the artist is also very strict and contemplative, and that's, again, something that sets it aside from regular artwork. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means too. So there's some terminology that is involved in the history and culture of icons. I talked about how they're written rather than painted. We also hold that the first icons were divinely created. So you might think, for example, of the image of Jesus on Veronica's veil, things like that. And because of that, every icon that comes after is supposed to be a copy of one that's been created before. And we do this as part of the practice to be able to go back to these first divinely created images so that each icon, even created now, has a spark of that divine image. And the first icons were inspired by Greek and Roman funerary art. That's just the culture out of which it came, of course, from the first early Christians. But that's also good to know, just to know that it didn't come out of nowhere. It was still very much involved and inspired by the culture that it developed in. And they also use the Greek symbols in Byzantine icons still from the dialect of Koine Greek to write the saint's name on that icon as well. The first ones were found in catacombs and secret chapels. This, of course, was because Christianity was still not allowed or legal in the areas and the time in which it first developed. And because of that, a lot of them used symbols that were also very important to Greek and Roman gods, so that if, for example, this art was found, it could be interpreted to just be a temple to one of the Greek or Roman gods instead. For example, using fish for a symbol of Jesus and his miracles could also be a symbol for the god Poseidon or some other Greek mythology or Roman mythology. And then the icons that we picture now, that we have in our heads, if we think of an image of an icon, mostly are from around the 11th and 12th century when this practice became safe. So there was a really long history of iconoclasm, which is really the practice of believing that icons are idols, and because of this, destroying a lot of icons. And there were church leaders as well as government leaders who practiced this, and then there were church leaders as well as government leaders who were on the other side that were big proponents of icons. So not only were cultures at the time that were Christian being invaded by other faiths and their icons were being destroyed, but they were also sometimes being destroyed within the church as well, just because of these big different ideas about whether or not they were right or something that was good and something that should be followed within the faith. And because of this, they didn't really start surviving until the 11th and 12th century. We do have some older ones, but they might not look exactly the same as the ones from this time period or the ones that we might picture, just because they weren't as strict in the set rules universally yet. But it's in this time period when there are rules for the shapes, the lines, the way that their faces and expressions should look, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we talked about how the person is portrayed as they are in heaven, and this is really showing a few characteristics that are across the board in all different styles of icons, in that they're supposed to be androgynous, unrealistic, and have impersonal faces to show the person as they are in heaven. And the basic words here to remember are purified and simplified. So they don't have to worry about anything that happens on earth anymore, no suffering or joy or trials or anything. And so that's why they usually don't have much expression or much to show on their faces. And then we also talked about how they must be a basic copy of another icon. So you can see sometimes when artists are creating icons, they always have one right next to them that they're basing it off of. But it is their job to, even though they're basing it off of something else, always be developing. And this is sort of an idea of developing always towards something that's more perfect and more divine and closer to God and the saints that they're portraying. Most icons also have really immense eyes. And I think that this is really cool because not only are you contemplating the saint, they are really looking right back at you. It's really this idea of seeing each other being seen. And what can that do in your contemplation of this piece of art? And you'll also see a lot of gold, sometimes gold leaf or metallic paint in icons. This always represents heaven. A lot of backgrounds are always gold. And then light and life. So the saints illuminated our world through what they did, through who they were, and this is just a symbolic representation of that. And then they have few characteristics. So, for example, if they were known for a certain hairstyle or facial features, sometimes they won't even have that represented in these traditional icons. Just because, again, we're talking about how they are in heaven, so if you're coming up with this idea of they're perfected in heaven, then they wouldn't have those things that are different. And then again, I'll talk a little bit about how my process developed and which of these rules I wanted to keep and which I wanted to toss and why. And that's one of them for sure. So the process of creating icons, again, I talked about how this is something that's really important and strict for the artist. The first step is that they prepare and receive a blessing and an assignment. So most of these traditional icons were being created by monks in monasteries throughout Europe and Asia. And they're always being given the assignment of which icon they need to create. So maybe it's for their church, for another church, for some sort of study, something like that. They're never just coming up with the idea themselves. And they're separating themselves really from the rest of the world to be able to create this icon. So you can hear about them sometimes purifying and fasting for 40 days or longer sometimes. And it's really interesting as well because the first assignment when someone starts out as an iconographer is always supposed to be one of Jesus, specifically sometimes the Transfiguration, sort of symbolically starting as you're transforming into something else, becoming this artist, and you're going to be transforming this artwork as well. So the next step is to mix paints made of the earth elements. Something that I really love about traditional iconography is that it uses the different elements of the earth sort of as an offering in this work. So they use animal matter in that they use a paint that's called egg tempera, and it uses egg actually within the paint. They also use clay, and that's in some other earth minerals as well within the paints. And the background is wood. It's usually always painted on wood, so that's some offerings from the trees as well. And then the gold paint as well is always metallic, so it has the minerals there too. So the process, as I mentioned, is always meditative and developing. And icons have always been historically used as a method of teaching and contemplation. So if they're the visual representation of stories and histories of this person, then of course it would be the best way to share these stories and any idea about the faith in the times before people were literate and in the times before people spoke each other's languages, especially in a lot of missions across the world. These were really great teaching tools, and they can still be used as that today. And then something that's also important about icons is that the spaces that house them use incense and candles for veneration. Usually is always supposed to be a space that is pretty reverent, one that is set apart if it can be. So my project, it started actually with finding some discarded free pieces of wood at a yard sale. I'm always at yard sales. And it was my freshman year at CCAD, so of course I had no money for art supplies. There was a box of free things, and these pieces of wood reminded me of the wood that traditional icons had been painted up. And I had just started at college. As I mentioned, I'd been in Catholic school before that. CCAD is very small, and they have a few more student activity groups now, but at the time that I was there, they really didn't have any, and so they didn't have any faith-based groups either. And so I'd been really wanting to create a few pieces for my dorm room just to be able for me to keep connecting with my faith, have some sort of visual representation of that. And at this time, I really didn't know anything about the history and culture of iconography that I just went over, really nothing at all, honestly. And so I started these pieces knowing that I wanted to create one of Mary and the other of Jesus. And I wasn't really sure how to finish them or even what style to paint them in. My world had just so completely changed with this transition, and I knew that I didn't want them to look anything like the art that I was used to, that I had grown up around. I already had so many new ideas and perspectives just from being around all these new people, and I really didn't think that what I was used to would be really appropriate for that situation. But I didn't know what style exactly that would be, so I was super eager to start these, however. So I had already finished the facial features and arms and hands of the image of Jesus, but didn't know what sort of clothing to put him in. And so as I thought about this and spent a few nights trying to think it over, I left him in sort of what looked like a white t-shirt. And in that amount of time that I was contemplating this, the longer I sat with just that image, the more I realized how powerful that actually was and how much he looked like all the students around me and all the people that I could just walk outside and see. And I realized how powerful that could be. So I created the image of Mary to be in sort of a modern 21st century style, just like that. And that was really going to be the end of it. I was happy with those. I had them on my dorm room wall, and yeah, they were good to go. But then I decided to post the image of those pieces on my social media. All of a sudden, all of my Catholic school friends came out of the woodwork to request images of saints that were special to them in that style as well. So I sort of took on this project without expecting that to happen, without realizing how much farther it would go. I had so many requests and commissions for all these different saints after that. But as I mentioned, I wasn't in school for painting. I was there for interior design and architecture. So this was really just a side project that I pursued while I was there for all 4 years. and I had booths at the art fair to sell some of these works. And the longer that I was sharing these things and creating more of them, the more I realized how powerful they were and how many different ways I could use them for all of these ideas that I had. And I didn't even realize it was the most perfect intersection that I could find of all of the things that I was so passionate about and cared about. And then when I became an RA in my last 2 years there, taking care of students as a resident advisor, I learned so much more about these people and who they were and what their backgrounds were. And a lot of them had been so hurt by people in the name of Christianity, or even cast out of their homes because of who they were or decisions that they'd made. And so a lot of them were very hesitant or tentative to try and have any sort of faith in their lives, even if it had been something that was originally really important to them. And so the more that I realized I could have these saints look like these people, the more I hoped they would realize that the saints were exactly just like them. I always had loved learning about saint stories when I was in school, just because they were so different. And anything that you could be going through, there is a saint that has been through that before and has come out on top from that struggle or joy or whatever it was. And so many of them also had been hurt by Christians in their backgrounds and had done and been through everything that these students around me also had been. And so to try and give them hope and a new idea of what it could mean to be a saint or a person of faith, having some saints represented that look like them, I hoped would be the best way. I mean, with representation, you're able to see how much these people were just like you, and in turn, how much you can be like them. So they might not have to have the same ideas that were hurtful that had been installed in the first place. And then at the same time, creating images like this for the friends that I originally had as well, who were still within the faith community, I would be able to change hopefully some of their ideas as well about who qualifies as a saint and who can and will be a saint. Maybe they had been part of the hurt that had been perpetuated to these other students. Maybe they had preemptively judged or cast out some of these people as well. So to be able to see the people that they may have judged or hurt be portrayed as saints could change their ideas as well, to make their ideas much more expansive and loving for everyone involved. So I've started hinting at some of this a little bit, but really once I made it a priority to keep going with this work and to pursue it as a project that I would create really a whole business around and a whole project around, I decided to keep and toss some of the traditional rules of iconography that I went over, and then I had reasons for each of those choices as well. So some of the things that I wanted to keep were having the names of the saints on these pieces. And I do try to keep them in the traditional Greek. I'm not a Greek scholar by any means. However, I do try to copy them as well as I can from traditional ones, or get as close as I can, some of the more modern ones that don't have traditional icons. I've also decided to keep the solid background colors in all of these pieces, just because that way you're able to more easily contemplate the person that is portrayed without anything going on in the background. You're not distracted, and you're able to just see this person more easily as just a person, which is really important. And it's another way also for me to be able to take their story and who I picture them being and find a color that I think most represents that energy or that personality of them. I also keep the wood bases. So I mentioned how I found the first two at a yard sale, and every piece since then has not also been from a yard sale, but close. They're all repurposed pieces of wood, and they all had previous lives. So some of them were things such as candle holders or cutting boards or plaques that hung on the wall with really cheesy quotes on them, anything like that. And I love keeping this process for this project because I see these pieces of wood as a metaphor for the saints themselves. So they all come from different places, they're all different shapes and sizes and had previous lives, most of them, And from some of them, with these previous lives, they have scars or chips or things that I'll need to paint over, or things that I do paint over and then they end up showing back through in the end anyway. And this I love because I think it's so representative of the lives of the saints becoming something transformed really and through their sainthood. And because of that, they are now revered, just like these wood pieces that wouldn't have a new life otherwise. It wouldn't be appreciated otherwise. And I've also decided to keep some of the poses and symbols that these traditional icons have these saints in. So if part of the goal of traditional icons are to make sure that they all look pretty much the same and pretty much just like each other, one of the ways that you can tell them apart on church walls is through some of their poses or symbols that they're holding that are representative of the life they lived or perhaps how they were martyred or something that was really important to them. And I decided to keep this the same in my work as well. I want them to be easily identifiable for anyone who knows their story or knows anything about them, just because, again, that's another way that they can be represented. If it's something that's important to them as well, then they can see themselves in these pieces too, through those symbols. I also have decided to keep the contemplative and prayerful process. I'll talk a little bit about what that means for me, but I do really try to set myself apart and take assignments for these pieces through commissions and work on it in a really prayerful setting and prayerful manner. I don't use the egg tempera paints, unfortunately, but I do also try to work in thin layers. This is a way to let some of the light shine through, and it also makes it a harder process, which doesn't seem intuitively a good choice, but that lends itself to being more contemplative because it's something that I have to think through more and that takes much longer. And then I've also decided to make sure that the colors still have meaning. So in a lot of these traditional icons, some saints will always be wearing the same colors, and that's because some of these colors have very strict meanings, such as life or death or mysticism, asceticism, things like that. And then in regards to what I decided to toss from traditional iconography, there were really well thought out choices that I made in these decisions. I really love and appreciate traditional iconography, and I understand all the reasons for those choices. But in this project, if I really wanted to make sure that these were people that the people around me could relate to, there were some things that I had to change. And the first of that is the expressionlessness that's on traditional icons. I really love to make sure that all of my saints show basically any expression that we can have, any emotion or feeling that we can go through in our lives, just because we can be reminded of how human they were because of that. They had to go through those exact same things that we're going through, and they felt every range of everything that we can feel. And we can find more hope and healing in that because we know that they've done it before us. The next thing that I thought was most important to change was their whitewashed facial features and skin tones that are on a lot of these traditional icons. So as I mentioned, a lot of the people creating these were monks who were in monasteries, very enclosed, and may never have honestly left their monastery to see that there were people in the world outside of that small group that looked any different than they were. But the other reason that a lot of these European icons did this was because they wanted to relate to Jesus and the saints, just as I'm trying to do in this project. However, we know by now, or at least should know by now in our current day and age, that this is really not the way to go about that, because we know that as historically was not accurate, first of all, and to be more historically accurate does a great service to all of these people, because erasing any part of their identity of the perfect way that God created them is erasing part of their story and who they were and what they went through and what their life was really like. So it does not only the saint themselves, but God and God's creation a real disservice because of that. And we can also, by correcting these features, to have them look as if they lived where they really lived and existed on Earth in the area that they were actually from. This also helps us to reestablish the diversity that sometimes seems lost within these church images. Like, we know all of these saints were from the Middle East and Asia and Northern Africa, and we know this, but we just still don't even picture these saints that way, unfortunately, because of these icons that were whitewashing their features. And we can remember how diverse the church and the faith really are if we do these corrections as well, because it's true that we can find ourselves represented no matter where we're from in the world. We just forget that sometimes because of these traditional images. And another thing I decided to change was their period clothing or robes that they're often portrayed wearing in these pieces. And that's because, again, if we're trying to relate to them, it's kind of hard to see the biography of a saint that lived in 500 and know that even though their story is exactly the same, that you're able to relate to them. If they are wearing something that your friend or a family member or someone you know might wear, they remind you of the friend or family member or someone you might know, then you can more easily make the connection of that friend or family member being a saint, or you yourself as well. I also mentioned how I decided to toss the practice of erasing any saint's imperfections or personal characteristics. And this is because I do just believe that we are all created perfectly. And if we are erasing whatever it may be, whether it's an injury or a disability or some sort of specific feature that is personal to you and how you look, I don't really believe that those are imperfections. And so, if these people are being portrayed as they are in heaven, I don't believe that that would have to be a requirement for becoming perfect. And then the last thing that I decided to change was automatically aging a lot of these saints. So in these traditional icons, many of them are portrayed as much older people. This is just because at the time, age was symbolic of wisdom, and of course the saints were supposed to be the most wise people around. So even if they didn't actually live to be very old, they were shown as much older. They were also given some of those features to represent asceticism as well, if they were someone who was always fasting and staying in prayer. As I mentioned, though, historically they just did not actually live to be very old, and some of them were martyred when they were very young. And this is also another way that I hoped for the students around me to be able to relate to these saints. So we already have so many images of the saints as much older people, and so anyone who is older can already find images that they can see themselves in. However, young people can't always find that. And so through this, I hoped that they would realize that they don't have to wait to be a saint either. They don't have to have a certain level of wisdom or a certain number of years to be able to start doing what it is that they want to do to change the world and be a saint. So my current process of beginning a commission comes from a request from someone who has a certain connection to a saint, or perhaps a church that's named after a certain saint. And they tell me a lot about why it is they think that saint is important. But then I go and do my own research as well, all about their life, anything that I find interesting about how the saints represented in modern culture, really any path that I can go down that has something to do with this saint. I love research, so I love taking this time to just learn everything that I can about them and translate their story to the modern day by thinking about anyone I might know who reminds me of them, what they might be doing in our current day if they were living today. I also search for a lot of reference images. Most of these images are a combination of a ton of different references that I put together in a huge Pinterest board. And then that comes from searching images of people who live today or they lived in their day, any sort of clothing or hairstyle that I think represents who they might have been, as well as those symbols that I was talking about that are representative of their skills or who they were. And then I also write the saint's biography before starting, just to make sure that I have a really clear idea of what I'm working with. And then I decide to, as I mentioned, set myself apart. I choose a playlist and a space, or for example, a scent or a tea or some sort of lunch or what I'm wearing, just to set the atmosphere and really make sure that I am getting into character, I guess you could say, of who this person was. And then I spend time in prayer and meditation throughout. Again, usually having something to do specifically with who that person was. And I also decided to allow mistakes and changes along the way. So when I started out with this project, I would get super frustrated when it didn't turn out the way that I hoped it would. Again, I didn't go to school for painting, so really I'm honestly a self-taught painter, so I know that I'm not the best artist around, but I knew that this project was worth pursuing, even without that formal training, and so I would get very frustrated when things just didn't go the way that I was hoping that they would. But now I've honestly decided to allow any mistakes that happen to create change in these images, just because I have started to see it instead as really the Spirit leading me in that direction. And honestly, the pieces where I've allowed this to happen have been much more interesting than anything I could have ever come up with. So this is something that I always do now. And then I end each piece with adding the saint's name. And this is something from, as I mentioned, traditional iconography. And this is because it's supposed to confer the spirit of the saint on the image. And here are some examples of some traditional pieces versus mine, and you can see so many of the similarities that I try to keep. So, for example, color schemes, or what they're holding, what they're wearing, their facial expressions, some sort of image that has to do with their story. So, for example, St. Agnes in the top corner here is always shown holding a lamb, and then in this other top corner, St. Ignatius of Antioch, devoured by lions, has symbols of lion paws on his clothing. And then in this bottom piece here, St. Christopher, whose story is about carrying the infant Jesus across a river, has that image of an infant Jesus on his shirt and carries still a walking stick. And here are some more examples of that. Again, some of the same color schemes or expressions. Sometimes I'm unfortunately not able to keep much from original pieces based on the rules that I've come up with for this project, but usually I am able to keep at least a little bit and have it be somewhat similar to some of the originals, harkening back to the way that those originals were created. So what does this do, or what do I hope that it does? First of all, to show how much we are like the saints, so that in turn we can realize that they were like us. If our stories are so much like theirs, then we know that we can be saints as well with whatever we hope to do with our lives. And then I talked a little bit about how I can hopefully give hope and a deeper reflection for those both within and outside of the church with this project, and also realize the hidden diversity and forgotten ideas and perspectives of these saints. So the more I'm able to do this research on these people, sometimes I find one saint right after another had a directly conflicting idea with the saint that I just painted before, but they're both saints. And so that can give us a lot of hope in our current day, because we know that even if we might have an idea that's a little different than the ideas of the people around us, that doesn't mean we can't still be a saint, or that it's wrong. And then there is a place for all of us in the church if we want there to be, but we have to be the ones to make sure that that's true for everyone, and we can all be saints. And I think this is really important because of quite a few reasons, but the first being that there have been many university studies that show that the way that we imagine the person who is most good or holy or powerful, which for many of us is Jesus and God and the saints, whichever way we picture them is the way that we will subconsciously picture the people who are most good and holy and powerful in our society. And so, of course, if we only have images of Jesus and God as older white men, then unfortunately that will inspire our image in our heads of who is most powerful and holy and good, and we'll think that only older white men are the ones who are the most powerful and holy and good in our society. And of course we know that that's really damaging and not correct. And so changing some of this imagery to inspire our visual image of who those people are can change that as well. And then of course the church in particular has a really long history of erasure and harm of a lot of cultures and a lot of people through missions, through colonization, and since the church itself was the reason for a lot of those colonizations and missions, continuing to erase who those people really were by portraying them in a way that isn't accurate, just continues that erasure and continues that harm and damage. And so trying to undo some of that in visual art is just the smallest way that I can try to combat that myself. And then learning about the saints and seeing them look like us can also help us realize our own gifts and callings. Again, I mentioned how there's a patron for everything. Every type of sport you can think of, computer programming, gardening, teaching, any type of job you can have. And because of that, we can realize that even if we have skills and talents and callings and things that aren't necessarily related to your faith or the church, you know that because of these saints, through these examples, we can still use those things to be saints. We can still find a way to live our lives in a way for God and for faith that aren't even necessarily things you might have considered before, just because we have this vast source of examples. And then through that, outside of the church as well, anyone can find role models in history and in those around us doing this project, hopefully. Here are just a few of the more than 150 that I have now. And I'll never run out. There's new saints every year, and there's also already hundreds. So these are just a few, some newer ones and some older ones, and I'm still working on a bunch of commissions every year, and I don't have any intention of stopping anytime soon. And then, as you might have noticed, I do have a new book as well. It is available from pretty much all booksellers. It came out in December, and it was a really amazing project because not only does it feature 52 of my pieces, but each one is accompanied by an author that I really respect and look up to, who has reflected on why that saint is still relevant today. So if visual learning and meditation isn't really your thing, or you can't connect to art by itself very well, this is a really good way to have words and reflections from people that still are taking the saints into the current day and talking about why they're still good. And this is my contact information if you have any more questions. I do have a mailing list that you can sign up for on my website if you're interested. I do try to put out at least one new icon every month, so that will always update you about that if you're interested. And then on my social media platforms, I have posts that I put up for every saint feast day. So the official calendar of the year has a ton of saints for each day of the year that has a saint that is celebrated on that day. But of course, I only have about 150 of them, so it's still most days. But on those days, I put up ideas on how you can celebrate that saint's feast day, basically by doing something that would have been important to that saint, or sharing that saint's story with someone, or continuing on that saint's legacy, basically. So those are just a few interesting things that you can do to continue trying to take the saints into the current day and learn what you can from them. So, all right. I do have time for a few questions, but thank you so much for having me today. I love being able to talk to you about this, so thank you.
You're an astonishing young lady. That was just fantastic. Everything you were saying was truth.
Thank you. I hope so. That was beautiful.
It's like the process has affected you. You become somewhat transcendent.
I really hope so.
They're like portals. It's another way of thinking of them, isn't it?
It is. I really think so.
Portals to the divine. How big are the pictures? Really? Are these?
So they're actually pretty small. These three over on the end here are some originals. I usually don't go larger than 12 inches. That's just usually because of the types of wood that I can find, but they also aren't traditionally super huge.
So this is the size.
Yeah.
What did you mean by I paint thinly, I use thin paints. What does that exactly mean? I didn't understand that.
Yeah, so traditionally, the egg tempera paint that I mentioned that they use is very, very thin, and that's sort of to let light shine through. So, like you might talk about an icon being illuminated, and that's not only from the gold paint or the metallic paint, but also because light can go through the layers. So, an icon might honestly look like it's sort of like glowing almost because of the type of paint that they use. And so, the paint that I use is also very thin layers. And because of that, you have to really work to build up each layer to get to the color that you want. So it just takes a lot longer. And yeah, it's a more difficult process for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great.
So Gracie,
Uh-huh.
what saint is that on this contact slide?
Yeah, this one is Our Lady of Guadalupe. So you might have seen the image of that one before. It's a pretty famous image from Mexico. It was an apparition of Mary to Saint Juan Diego, and it appeared on his clothing. So they still actually have it today in a church in Mexico, which is pretty cool. But this is a more modern rendition, and there's a snake that she's usually stepping on and crushing, representing the devil. And instead, I have it as the border wall. So it's just taking it again into the current context.
Question. I'm wondering, have you ever been approached or contacted by the Catholic Church or the Eastern Church in either a friendly or not so friendly way based on what you're doing?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Can you-
Both.
Really?
Yeah.
Any interesting tidbits to share about?
Oh, definitely, yeah. So I would say that I usually have a really positive feedback, which I appreciate. It's what gets me to keep going. However, every once in a while, I do have some pretty negative messages. I always feel like, even when I was in school still, that the work is too secular for religious spaces and too religious for secular spaces. So it's really hard to find that audience. It's a very niche audience, that's for sure. That's also sort of why I had to stop selling my work in person. It's a much easier way to find that audience online. But every once in a while, yeah, I will have some pretty negative comments that really range from blasphemy to just not being very good, you know. But it's because of that also that I keep going, because if it wasn't thoughtful enough to make some people upset, then I don't think it's thoughtful enough to do anything good. So, you know, that gives me hope as well. And every once in a while, a church militant group will find my work and everyone will attack at once with lots of comments and things, you know how social media goes these days. But even that sort of thing just sort of reminds me that it's doing something. So that's important. Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
Troy.
what would you have done if you hadn't done this?
That's a good question. So I worked full-time for a year after I graduated in a online auction, basically, and my job was to go through the artwork and find out who the artist was, what type of art it was. And that was really fascinating to me because, again, I love research and history and all of that. But I'm not sure I would have stuck with that forever. So that's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, just a comment, maybe. Growing up Protestant versus Catholic, we didn't have statues of Mary or St. Christopher medals or objects or things like buried in the front yard. Although we did that when we were trying to sell our house.
Oh, yeah. You have to do whatever you can.
Just to help out. So you become an unintentional expert on icons. You must be a collector of icon stories now too. I remember in residency in Toledo, where there was a large Orthodox, I'm not sure, it was Eastern European from somewhere,
Yeah.
but they had their icons that were really pretty important to them, sacred to them, and mystical or miraculous to them.
Yeah.
Because whether they were family or church owned, I'm not sure, that they would appear in people's hospital beds right next to them as, you know, a source of power or hope. So have you heard those stories, or have your icons been have they crossed into the mystical or miraculous, and people use them in a healing sense?
Yeah, so I actually got to go to Greece in September, which was amazing because the icon culture there is so much more powerful than anywhere here. Every church only houses maybe 1 or 2 families, and there's so many, like they're even on Long Island, there's like 300 churches, and they all have the icons that are really important to them too, and you can just see the reverence that they have for these. But yeah, there's a lot of stories about these icons sometimes doing things like crying, like tears show up in their eyes, or blood or something like that. So yeah, I would say in the Eastern Orthodox faiths and Catholic faiths even, there is like a much deeper culture even of these icons being super important. And even the Egyptian Coptic Christian faith as well, I've been learning more about that too. They're really even more important than just for contemplation and meditation. And that's not something that I personally have encountered, or something that I think is even necessary for what I hope for this project to accomplish. But it is really interesting if you're curious about that. There's a lot of really interesting spiritual, mystical things with that. Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
You've had a chance to do this project with others in a class setting. You have come along the path that you've taken. What about some of the other students? What effect has it had on some of the others? And have they had similar experiences, or have they diverged and just gone off to do their thing?
Yeah, so what I think is really cool is that honestly there's a lot of modern iconographers right now, which I think is really cool. Some of them stick much more traditionally to the rules that I mentioned than I do, but they still are trying to accomplish really pertinent current ideas and notions through these pieces, which I think that's just really fabulous. And some of them have developed really different styles from each other. Some of them take inspiration from things like comic book art or watercolor as a medium, and really try to make it their own, which I think, again, I mentioned how traditional iconography is important, and I appreciate it for what it is. But the more different styles we can have, the more different ideas and artists behind these pieces that we can have, I think the more that it will relate to so many different people, and people will be able to find what they're looking for in icons more easily that way. So I just really hope even more people will start to do this. I think other faiths need it as well within their traditions. There are plenty of revered people within all different religions, and I think that they could really use this practice as well. I think it would inspire a lot of younger people to come back to what they find important. Yeah.
I'm thinking of the Black artist that has become very well known, who concentrated on Black people and put them in fantastic settings, like
Oh yes, I know.
Orange dress or
Uh-huh.
the flowered wallpaper behind.
Right. Yeah.
Does this harken back to the school and your first projects, let's say?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I would say,
Similarity.
yeah, I think so. And I know which artist you're talking about, and his work is really doing the same thing, just not in a religious context. You know, it's making these people look more like they're royalty, or like they're from the Renaissance paintings of wealth and everything. And I think that that's really important too. But yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that that is inspirational to me. A lot of other icon artists are inspirational to me. But in terms of what was most inspiring for like getting this started, I guess, would be just the small projects I was assigned on a regular basis while I was in school, just about a different site every time, because I would always get so excited to learn about who this person was and how they're so different from everybody else.
I'm happy for you. This is good.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. Thanks for having me.
we'd like to talk to Gracie about doing some workshops.
Yeah.
So we could, as she had said, do we have time to have people work on who their saints might be? And I said, I don't think we have that kind of time in this setting, but I think it might be worth exploring if you're interested in doing some work with her in a labor format.
Have you done that before? Provide that.
Yes, so I have run a class a few times, once virtually and one in person, about developing your own practice of iconography, if that's something that you're interested in too. And then I also have activities that I do on a really regular basis of drawing yourself as a saint and trying to figure out what colors and expressions and clothing and symbols would be important to you. And then another version, if you're not as artistically inclined, of coming up with a schedule. Like if you picked any saint, what would their schedule look like if they were living in your neighborhood and going to your church and living in today?
So do you think about a schedule upon which you'd like to push out some content to us, and we'll be reaching out very soon about that. Probably aiming for maybe the winter.
Okay, great.
Yeah, this has been amazing. And to make this kind of thing accessible to ordinary, everyday people who are not seeing themselves as saints and maybe don't do a lot with making art or feeling, or who are maybe feeling a need to be accessing their creativity, and what a good thing that is for all of our souls. Everybody, next week will be our last forum for this program year. We'll start back up in the fall. We're so grateful to Gracie for joining us, who brought some things for us to look through and consider bringing home. And I'll just point out, 7 minutes will serve. Okay.
And the exhibit is up until the end of July.
Awesome. Thank you, that is so generous.
Appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
I really thank you very
Thank
much.
you.